Hi, and welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Today on the show, we have Anusha Viswanathan and Jennifer Bish. Anusha is a pediatric infectious disease physician, and Jennifer is a pediatric nurse practitioner. Anusha wrote the article, A Pandemic of Bullies Over Others. Anusha and Jennifer, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
So we'll get into your article and story in a little bit, but first off, I'm going to ask each of you a little bit of a story and journey to where you are today. Anusha, why don't you go first?
Yeah, so I'm a mom of two children, almost 5 and 2. My background is pediatric infectious disease. I had a little bit of a circuitous way of getting to the infectious disease part. I took a couple of years between residency and fellowship where I worked abroad in Rwanda. So I had a little bit of global health background during that time, and that really sparked my interest in infectious disease. And then I kind of came back and did my training.
So Anusha, as a pediatric infectious disease physician, what would you say are some of the biggest challenges over the past 18 months of the pandemic that you faced?
The biggest challenge was sort of not understanding what exactly the impact of COVID was in children initially. And it took a little bit of time to sort of discern how children were being impacted. And I think the other learning point was understanding that, when adults around kids get significantly ill, that also has an impact on children. So there was a lot of things about COVID, both in terms of direct impact and indirect impact, that presented a lot of challenges. And I think one of the things that really personally affected so many of us was the fact that children were out of school. And it seemed like schools were the first thing that sort of shut down. And I think there are lessons to be learned from that. And so that we should put forward as schools have reopened, sort of prioritizing the mental health and the education of children in a way that still keeps them safe. So those were some of the challenges that I thought really came through in the last 18 months.
And Jennifer, can you share your story and journey to where you are today?
So I started out as a bone marrow and oncology nurse, and I was a floor nurse for 12 years. So a lot of my background was working with these immunocompromised patients. And currently I work as a community primary care nurse practitioner in the same community I live. I have 3 children, ages 7, 5, and 11 months. And in the whole first year of the pandemic, or first 10 months of the pandemic, I was primarily home with my 3 children and navigating virtual school with my 7-year-old. So I can definitely echo to Anusha's thoughts on how the pandemic impacted children. And I think that where I primarily am right now is trying to balance the idea of keeping kids in school, but doing it in a safe way, not ignoring the fact that the pandemic is still occurring, but addressing it with mitigation and focusing on the fact that the mitigation is the primary way to keep kids in school. And that if we don't take those if we don't take those mitigation measures, we're putting our schools in danger of closing down again, and I would just love to get everybody on that same page and focusing on that same thing.
So we're speaking on towards the end of September now, and kids are in school for a month and a half or so. So Jennifer, how are we doing so far from what you've seen, both in your area and across the country?
So I think that we kind of got a heads up. So by the time Pennsylvania schools opened, we saw kind of what happened in other parts of the country, and that those schools kind of very quickly shut down when they didn't have any mitigation in place. And we kind of got a chance to learn from that. In particular, in our county, I think we struggle with a balance of incorporating mitigation and the thoughts of different parents in the community. I know in our particular school system, we've now been open since the last week of August, and I think we're still learning. So our district right now has some mitigation in place, including masks for their mandatory masks, but we kind of are struggling to kind of get other mitigation put through, like in my particular school district, mitigation such as quarantine, and that varies in our area, both from district to district and county to county for Pennsylvania.
All right, let's transition into the Kevin MD article titled "A Pandemic of Bullies Over Others." Anusha, for those who didn't get a chance to read that article, can you just walk my audience through it and share the story of why you decided to write it?
Actually, the whole thing came about pretty organically. The background is that another doc reached out to area medical providers, and Jennifer and I among them, saying that the district COVID plan would be in discussion at a school board meeting, and would other medical people come to sort of provide input. And eventually, our voices were being entirely drowned out in these school board meetings. And we thought maybe we could have a press conference where we could have more control of the dialogue. We could talk without interruption. And that would be a better way to sort of get our message as area medical providers into the community, which on our message was basically, hey, COVID is real. COVID mitigation strategies work, and they work to keep kids in school. And I think I approached this in a pretty naive way. So in the article, I initially talk about sort of going up to this makeshift podium that we had and like changing my case numbers, the incidence of COVID as I was walking up to it, just to make sure I was totally up to date, because I really thought if I articulated facts well, that would seize the day, so to speak. But what I didn't account for was these, I guess they would call themselves counter protesters, who arrived that day in sort of a much bigger group. And they were organized, they were ready to disrupt. And I think they disrupted probably in such a dehumanizing way that was so shocking. I don't think I was prepared for that at all. I wasn't prepared to be called a murderer or a child abuser. I definitely wasn't prepared to be called an illegal alien. I wasn't prepared to hear the Black man who was holding the microphone for me, because I was really shaky at that point. The crowd chanting, "I can't breathe," at him, very, very clearly, pointedly at him. And I wasn't prepared for how they heckled the high school student who spoke beautifully and eloquently. And I think that was probably the worst moment. And I think that was the impetus for my article, because as the event was occurring, and as they were screaming about everything but what we were talking about, essentially just these like attacks on our personhood, as soon as that was happening, the crowd was live streaming and changing the dialogue almost immediately to portray themselves as being bullied. And it was such an untruth of that event. And I think, right after that event, there was a lot of chatter in the community. Well, there are two sides to everything. There are, people on both sides have strong opinions. And that did not feel like what that was about. It did not feel like a two sides argument. It did not feel like a 2 points of view with valid, validity on each side. It was an attack. And I think that was sort of my, what I wanted to communicate as the person experiencing that moment.
So Anusha, paint us a picture of what that room was like. How many counter protesters were there, and how big approximately was the total audience, so we can get a better idea of what it looked like?
Yeah, we actually held it outside. It was in front of the school board administrative offices. So we did try to make it as COVID safe as possible. We actually just invited press know this was happening. So I think one of the lessons that we learned was, in a community, nothing is a secret. Somehow word got out. I would say it felt like we were outnumbered at least 2-1. There were a small group of us on the podium. There were 4 speakers. There were activists from the community. There was one peacekeeper, which is essentially a community activist who's there to sort of defuse the situation. So there weren't very many of us, because honestly, we were not expecting anyone to come, or even if we were. I think initially we actually offered to share a space and time in that we'll finish talking, and then you can actually have the microphone that we brought and talk to the press as well. But that was not the intent. I think one of the things that happened very quickly was that we were surrounded both in front with the crowd and behind as well. So it felt like they were encircling us. And I think that was sort of the first way in which it felt almost physical in the sort of threatening nature of it.
Jennifer, you were also at that event. Please share your story from that event.
I guess I spoke right before Anusha, after Dr. Mahmood. And I guess I kind of saw what was occurring with Dr. Mahmood, and we wasn't at all what we were expecting. I had very similar thoughts to Anusha, that we would be able to present these facts and, kind of dispel some disinformation, like in particular, trying to dispel some disinformation about health hazards of masks and that masks work. And I think that I went into it thinking, I think people just need more information, and then we could all get on the same page. And I kind of watched what occurred and watched people heckling. And I think that the 2 things that struck me immediately, but I don't think I could process it until after, was the first thing was that usually healthcare, and any other time other than right now in 2021, I think healthcare providers getting up and providing information would have been met with respect and with courtesy for what we were saying, even if people disagreed with what we were saying. And it was almost like each thing that was said, the audience had a rehearsed counter thing to say when that keyword was said by us. So that was very surprising to me. And I was newer to dealing with our district at that point. Next thing that was really surprising to me was, having been in pediatrics for forever, I always encourage my patients to advocate for themselves and speak for themselves. And so when the student speaker got up, I think we were fearful before she even started speaking, to the point that, I guess while the adults had spoken, we had people holding signs behind us and pushing against us and heckling us. And we kind of wanted to at least make that student feel more protected. So we asked if we could stand directly behind her so that nobody was touching or pressing against her while she spoke. And she specifically asked the audience for people to recognize that she was a student and that all these measures are for students, and to please just not yell over her. And people immediately began yelling at her. And as she spoke, people were yelling things about being an illegal alien. She spoke about having grandparents die in India, and people actually screamed at her, good. And watching her, this very well-spoken, very educated, smart young lady who has spoken at other events so eloquently and without any fear or hesitation, start shaking, was just really, really hard, as someone who's taken care of patients my whole life, but also like as a mom. And this is someone's child standing there shaking. And I think the worst part of it was actually something that occurred after, because we, all went into the school board meeting and we all spoke at the school board meeting after. And the student was standing there and drinking water, and all of a sudden she got very nervous. And she asked me, do you know who that person is? Do you know who that person is? And she was pointing at somebody. And I actually didn't know I now know who the person was, but at the time I didn't. At the time, I only knew that that was somebody that had been like standing with us kind of on our side during the press conference. And she had said, well, she gave me water. And now, like, I guess she all of a sudden worried that somebody gave her water that had something in it. And I think that took me a lot of like, it traumatized me as a mom, because the idea of thinking that my kids are in this district and, hopefully would be as eloquent and want to stand up for themselves and stand up for science just the way she was doing. But then being made to feel that way was really hard to walk away from, and really hard to come back from.
Anusha, what were the repercussions from this event? What happened after?
What happened after was most of us, in terms of medical people who were there and the sort of pro-science, pro-mask people that were there, went immediately into a school board meeting. And actually what shocked me, Jen, was how quickly the crowd of counter protesters, or however they would label themselves, really like changed their tone in front of the school board. It's, and these meetings are very heated, but it was, like I said, it was almost like a rewriting of history. As soon as they walked in, they were so upset at how they were bullied outside, and they were communicating this to the school board. It was so startling, and as like I was just processing it, I didn't know what to do with that. So it was almost like they turned it on and then it turned off, and then they went into the school board meeting and presented an entirely rewritten version of events that just happened. And the interesting part was, though, they were well aware that they were being recorded on video, and TV crews were there. And that's how emboldened they felt at that moment, that they could do this without any impunity, essentially, without any repercussions. And it still sort of feels that way. But I think, at least for me personally, that was my moment of really pushing me into civic engagement in a way that maybe, like in college, you're engaged and you're doing all this, and then life happens and kids happen, and it's so easy to sort of step back and just make your world really small, and your family unit is, your world. And it's still that way. But I think for a lot of us, that moment triggered in us this idea of, if we are going to want this to change, there's no one else other than us. And I have to say, I think that was one of the most rewarding parts of what happened, was meeting, Jen and really a lot of women, really mothers in the community with who felt similarly, and who had sort of a similar feeling, like, we thought someone would take care of this for us while we raised our families, and and then sort of saying, no, it's us, we take care of this for us.
Jennifer, there were press crews, television cameras, presumably newspaper reporters were there as well. So when this event played out in your local public, what was the public's response to these counter protesters?
So it's funny. I guess somebody loaded it onto Facebook like live, and I couldn't watch it. Like I don't think I've watched it at all. I've watched like little parts of it since then, but I just like kind of like couldn't go back to that place. But my husband scrolled through and like read all the comments, and it's funny. He said like overall, he's like, most of the comments were related to the behavior being awful, and being that related to what was being yelled at was being like disinformation. We had, I think, I'm sure Anusha and everybody else involved had similar situations where people reaching out to us being like, I saw you on the news, are you okay? But it just, I don't know, I guess the community's reception to it was, I guess, kind of similar to what occurred at the press conference, but just in more proportional numbers, where we weren't outnumbered. There was kind of, maybe 60% of people saying, no, we need to get on this and we need to be proactive about the science side. And a majority of people saying that what occurred was inappropriate.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think that there was a difference in the written coverage of what of the event compared to, say, the television coverage. So there were camera crews, and they presented what happened in the 11 o'clock news. And I really, maybe I'm too close to the situation, but it really felt like the two sides argument was what was put forth, heated emotions in a two-sided, fight for masks or anti-masks. And it just distilled it in that way in the television news that happened right, at that night of. And I think that for me, that was another reason I felt like the narrative was so wrong. And that was one of the reasons I wrote my piece and, published it in a bunch of local places in the Philly Inquirer. But I think that was, it felt to me like a point had been missed, which was, you may have views about, when masks should be required, at what incidence rate, or things of that nature we could speak about. But when you call me an illegal alien for talking about health and safety, there's just nothing I can say to that. There's no argument that actually speaks to the fact. And I think that was sort of lost in the immediate press coverage. And I think also what was lost a little bit is not just that we were parents, that we were actually medical people talking, both as parents, but also as medical professionals. So it wasn't just two sets of parents, having two opposing views. It was more, there were people who had some degree of expertise talking in addition to being parents. And that felt, unfair as well, I think, or just not balanced, I would say. And I think a lot of the community maybe thought that it was sort of a one-off, like it happened, but perhaps aren't aware that it happened before that moment and has been happening since. And I think that's our sort of biggest, for me at least, the biggest thing that I want to communicate to my community is, wake up and take note of what's happening in your local school district. And I don't think that got captured either. But this conversation is moving, but it's slow.
We're talking to Anusha Viswanathan and Jennifer Bish. Anusha is a pediatric infectious disease physician. Jennifer is a pediatric nurse practitioner. And they're talking about the Kevin MD article, A Pandemic of the Bullies Over Others. Anusha and Jennifer, I'm going to ask each of you for your take-home messages to the Kevin MD audience. So Jennifer, why don't you go first?
So I think that my primary take-home message is that there's so much disinformation out there that we definitely just need to work as a healthcare community to continue to try to get out the message that this information's out there and combating it and giving it with facts. And sometimes it's so tiring. And sometimes we feel like nobody's hearing us and maybe it's just easier to give up or not have the conversation, but that we do need to continue to have that conversation. And we need to, stay true to the fact that while everybody has a place at the table and everybody has the right to their opinions, that sometimes opinions need to be weighed against facts, and we need to kind of, give everybody a voice. We need to make sure that we stay with facts and not just kind of allow the disinformation to take over.
And Anusha, what's your take-home message to the Kevin MD audience?
I think as medical professionals, we are in sort of a spot where we have, at least about COVID, a voice. We can use our experience, our expertise, our medical knowledge, but I think it can't stop there. I think that what I've taken from this is civic engagement is key, and that means stepping in even after COVID and staying engaged, because this isn't just about the physical health of our children. And Jen and I are both in pediatrics, and we know that children are impacted in a myriad of ways. And this is both about the physical, emotional, and mental health of our children, which is tied so closely to the school community. These are key years. And if we don't have civic engagement and we just have a sense of complacency, then we're done. And that was what I am learning and have learned so far.
Anusha and Jennifer, thank you so much for sharing your stories, and thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for having us.